Now let's make this a bit more complex. What if I don't just want to have my load feedback button here, but I also want to have a, let's say, /feedback route here. So not /API/feedback, but just /feedback, which should load a new HTML page. So a page rendered in the browser, which also lists my feedback. So now I want to add a new normal page, not an API route, but I want to add a new normal page. That is still possible. We can still add a feedback.js file here as well in the pages folder, but outside of API, or as you learned, alternatively, add a feedback folder with an index.js file in there. That's the equivalent to having a file named feedback.js on the level above. And that's therefore what I'll go with here. And then in this index.js file, inside of that feedback folder, we can again create our regular component, the feedback page component, which we export. And then here we can, of course, also render our list of feedbacks. And we can now, of course, also just fetch our feedback data whenever that component is rendered. For example, with help of useEffect to implement client-side data fetching, as you learned it in the data fetching section. But maybe we also want to pre-render this page and pre-fetch the data for pre-rendering. And that is something which we would do by exporting an async function called getStaticProps. That's what you also learned before in this course. We can still use these features even if we also use API routes in the project. Of course, I would say, because using API routes is an extra feature. It doesn't change the way Next.js works. So we can still add regular pages with features like getStaticProps to also have some server-side or Node.js code that is executed there when this page is pre-rendered. Now the interesting thing is though, what if we now here want to fetch our feedback data for pre-rendering this page? So here through props in this component, I expect to get my feedback items, let's say, and I want to map them into list items, where I then still output item.text and where I then still have my key set to item.id. But now feedback items should be received through props with help of getStaticProps. How can we now make that work? Well, we did see similar examples in the data fetching sections. There we, for example, also talked to Firebase, and we then used the fetch API here, the fetch function, here inside of getStaticProps to still send a request to an API and get data from there. And that works as you saw there. But whilst this is absolutely fine for external APIs, like the Firebase API, you should not use fetch inside of getStaticProps or getServerSideProps to talk to your own API. Instead, since this is all part of one project and therefore ultimately all served by one server, what you should do instead is write any Node.js logic that should execute here directly inside of getStaticProps. So if we have some logic in our API route, which also might need to be executed here inside of a regular page, then we should just make it available through an export so that we can run the code defined in the API route directly here inside of getStaticProps or getServerSideProps. So that means that here in this case, this code for building the feedback path and extracting the feedback should be executed directly here in getStaticProps. We just don't want to set some response status code and return a response, because that's not what getStaticProps is about. This is just about producing the data for our page component. But since I already have extract feedback and build feedback path in separate functions, we can just export these functions to make them available outside of this API feedback.js file, export both functions, and then in index.js, we can import these functions. We can import from going up one level, diving into API, diving into feedback, and import from there. Or we put those functions into a separate other folder and file right from the start. We could add a helpers folder on the root project level and store our functions in some file in there. That would also be fine. But here I'm importing from that API feedback file, and I'll import the build feedback path function and the extract feedback function. Now the cool thing is that Next.js will detect that what we're importing here is in the end code that will only use inside of getStaticProps, and therefore that code will still not be included in the client-side bundle. I talked about this in earlier sections already. Code used in getStaticProps and dependencies used in there, so imports used in there, will not end up in the client-side code bundle if we're not using that code anywhere in our client-side code. So therefore here, we can now call build feedback path to construct our file path here. And then we can get access to our data by calling extract feedback and passing in the file path. And then we just return our standard object with the props key, as we always do it in getStaticProps. And we expose our feedback items, because that's what I'm looking for on my props here, which is my data. Because the data I'm extracting is that extracted array from feedback.json. So now we have that code here inside of our regular page instead of using fetch and sending a request to our own API route. Because when working with your own API routes and when requiring them in your regular pages, you should not send the HTTP request to them, but instead leverage the fact that it's all running on the same computer, on the same server. And therefore, just import it and directly run that code instead of sending that unnecessary HTTP request. And with that, if we save all of this and I visit my domain/feedback, you see that is also showing up there. And if we view the page source, we see that it was pre-rendered because of getStaticProps. So that is how you should interact with your API routes when you're using that data for pre-rendering a page. No matter if you're using getStaticProps or getServer-side props.